Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to Russia in Context. I know it's been a while since we caught up on the news, so we're back with another edition of the Russian Week in Context, though I will say right off the bat that this will be the last of this type of video. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't be filling you all in on domestic current events here within Russia, simply that I'm going to switch up the formula a bit, but I'm going to get into that a little bit more in detail at the end of this video. As it stands, there's plenty to talk about, so let's dive into the stories from February 21st through March 4th. Let's begin with a follow-up to last time's main story. In the days immediately following the death of Alexei Navalny, his mother, Lyudmila Ivanovna, and his lawyer, after traveling into the Arctic where he was imprisoned, they could not get an answer as to the location of his body. On February 22nd, Lyudmila Ivanovna released a video claiming that the prison authorities had informed her that they would only release the body if she agreed to a secret burial in a place of their choosing, that if she didn't agree, they would do something to the body, and that time was working against her, that the body, that it was decomposing. So anyway, a few days after that video was released, right? Perhaps because their hands had been forced, the authorities did eventually hand over Navalny's body. But then the drama surrounding a funeral began. And as I theorized last time, this was not an easy thing to accomplish for various reasons. First of all, there were worries about large crowds. There were worries about potential blowback from authorities. So a number of churches just simply declined to host the services, although one was eventually found in Marino, in the southeast of Moscow. A grave was also not easy to find, but that's largely due, in fact, to just Moscow cemeteries being notoriously hard to find space in. Navalny's grave was supposedly sold for 8 million rubles. On April 29th, the day before the funeral, police were already placing barricades and additional video cameras in the area near the church and the cemetery. March 1st was the burial of Alexei Navalny, and thousands showed up for it. It was truly an impressive crowd. But I want to address a number of the arguments that I've seen made online regarding the turnout. Now, first, people claimed that not many people would show up before the funeral. They were making these claims, but then when photos and videos of the event began to spread across Telegram and social media, naysayers, well, they switched their song, and then they started to say that the number was only 6,000 to 12,000, which in a city of 13 million people should have been closer to 100,000 for it to even be considered relevant, that this low number proved that Navalny, that he just wasn't actually a popular politician, and that there is no real opposition in Russia. But this is kind of BS for a few reasons, as I see it. Firstly, the funeral, well, it was at the end of February, and although the weather was not very cold, visiting Navalny's farewell meant standing outside on one's feet without break for many hours, if not the majority of the day, and that's something that the sick and the elderly just wouldn't likely be up to. After all, look at this map. The metro everyone had to come from, Marino, according to the graphic, is something like half an hour by foot to the church and cemetery. Now, I do want to say, though, I'd guess it took more like 45 minutes to an hour. The reason for that being that I've ridden many times on my bike from Borisovsky Ponds, where the cemetery is, across the river to the area not far from the Marino metro, and that always takes me near 15 minutes, going mostly downhill at speeds 3 times that of an average pedestrian, unhindered by a crowd or blockades. Next, we have to keep in mind that it was a Friday afternoon. People were working and studying, and no matter how much Navalny might have meant to some people, it's just not exactly something that you're likely to take a day off for. Also, remember that metro station I mentioned earlier, right? Marino, it's one of the least convenient parts of the city to get to. Unless you live in the area, you're looking at 1 to 1.5 hours of travel time in one direction from most places in the city, which is going to dissuade some from coming. Though, we also have to finally talk about the fact that before the funeral, Some people online were expressing the need for caution, telling citizens to be careful as they could potentially be put onto the authorities' radar. There were photos of people who seemed to have been undercover police or military, seemingly photographing those people who were at the funeral, which is, more than a little suspicious in Russia. Who could forget that Moscow has one of the world's most extensive and best developed CCTV systems, which basically allows for the tracking of anyone basically anywhere in the city. If the authorities wanted to find somebody, they could. Still, despite all that, according to Belishotchik, which is an independent crowd counter organization who were stationed near the metro, the total number of people who attended the funeral was at least 16,000, though the number could be higher as people could have come from other directions. Thing is, that was just Friday, but then on Saturday and Sunday, the line of people wishing to lay flour on Navalny's grave and say their goodbyes, well, it just never ceased. On both days, people waited in lines that stretched long down the road away from the cemetery gates. By Sunday evening, the pile of flowers for Navalny had completely covered the grave and eclipsed the cross that stood tall over it on Friday. Over all 3 days, I'd wager to guess at least 20,000 people came, possibly more. But given the location, the lack of convenient transit routes there, the fact that roads weren't closed and all who attended were stuck to sidewalks and not large public squares, that's still an incredible number, at least to me. All the more when you consider that many people who left Russia over the last few years were likely supporters, and also that Navalny was labeled an extremist and terrorist by Russian authorities, and that shows of sympathy toward him could in theory be interpreted as one sympathizing with terrorist ideas, it's a crime which would almost certainly result in jail time. Anyway, since the weekend showed that people, they continued to show it up, that the numbers weren't as small as originally expected, tactics online shifted once again, and I've seen short articles saying that all this popularity, it doesn't actually mean anything, that Navalny wasn't really a politician anyway because he didn't win any elections, in Russia, of course. And so if anything, people are saying goodbye to a blogger, not an oppositionist, right? Not an opposition leader. And, honestly, at this point, whatever. Once that explanation doesn't hold up, people online, they'll just reframe their arguments, shift the goalposts once again. For those who have decided they dislike or hate Alexei Navalny, they'll find whatever explanation they want to downplay what they saw on Friday and then over the weekend. However, it's important to remember that for his supporters, and just in general Russians who don't fully support what their government is doing, Navalny's funeral was the largest gathering of people since the anti-war protests in late February and early March of 2022. And it showed them that they weren't alone, that there were more of them than they have likely realized. In the days before and after the funeral, a rumor regarding a possible prisoner exchange that would have seen Navalny freed for Vadim Krasikov, a Russian FSB agent that is being held in Germany for life in prison for murder. You might remember him if you watched the Putin-Tucker Carlson interview. Putin called him a hero. Anyway, I've seen rumors from all sorts of camps that there might have been a possible exchange, but I didn't really pay them really much mind, and I wouldn't recommend any of you do either, mainly because Navalny, with only Russian citizenship, it would have been an odd exchange, and I don't even know if such an exchange has been done before. If Navalny had dual citizenship, sure, I could imagine it, but as it stands, I just don't know how Western governments, how they could have made the case for the exchange to happen. Besides, Russia has detained enough Americans alone for them basically to get what they want in any prisoner exchange. On February 29th, Putin gave a big speech to the top brass among Russian politicians. It was something akin to the State of the Union. Now, political analysts in the days before and the hours leading up to Putin's speech, they just spent their time edging, basically. They just were imagining all the possible things he might discuss, what ideas he might put forth, which was, I don't know, it was just tiresome to trudge through all of it. I mean, just chill, guys. Wait a little bit, and then you can actually analyze what was said. It was in the news world, it was the same energy as like Star Wars or Marvel fanboys theorizing what's going to happen in the coming films, but significantly more boring and completely pointless. It was just trash throughout the news feeds. However, the speech did come eventually. What we got in the speech, which is in theory for outlining what the government needs to focus on in the coming year or so, it transformed really into Putin's kind of campaign speech. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what was said because he talked for 2 hours and it was almost all campaign promises, something that isn't really worth talking about unless actual steps are made in implementing these promises. But, I will summarize everything as such. Over the next 6 years, the Russian government will work on, I believe, 5, but it could be like 6 or 7, I don't remember exactly, social plans that will fix all of the problems with infrastructure, demographics, longevity, technology, economical independence, ecology, education, all the social woes. And in order to see these projects through, trillions of additional rubles are going to be added to the budget. 2.5 to 3 trillion every year to be exact. And that's assuming key interest rates at the central bank are kept at 16%. Now, I'm sure some of the projects will produce results, as some of them are pre-existing and are just set to be expanded upon. But I'm largely in agreement with the Telegram channels that questioned how it's all going to be paid for and why these problems, which, let's be real, have existed for some time now, are only being addressed in the 20th or 24th, depending on how you count, year of Putin's presidency. Did the speech make waves? Yeah, for sure. But like I have said, analysts were having a field day, right? Some of them were engaging just in these gratuitous verbal masturbation sessions, but most of them expressed skepticism or, at most, guarded optimism. Again, there was no outlined plan of how this would all work. So as with any campaign promises in any country, people who follow the inner machinations of the political machine here, they quickly lost interest, as is always the case with nice words lacking substance. We actually saw this reflected in the Vitsom surveys, which showed that the public's support for Putin was basically unchanged in the wake of all of these announcements. And one would expect that the public would add or would have higher support in the wake of it. Obviously, February 24th marked the 2-year anniversary of the start of the war, but it surprisingly didn't get as much coverage as I expected. One Telegram channel dedicated to a minute-by-minute recap of the events of that day in 2022 was the most worthy of attention, in my opinion, because even though 2 years seems like a short time, I realized that I'd forgotten most of the events of that first day. By and large, though, most Telegram channels chose to focus on the situation on the ground now, how things had changed in Russian society since that day. But just as teaching the war as a subject in state schools in a history class is a fool's errand, so is this sort of true, genuine reflection in the thick of it all, which is very much where we are right now. So yeah, a number of good pieces were written for the anniversary, but nothing much of substance, because what can be said about the conflict that is currently underway, one which everyone is still trying to make sense of realistically every day. We're about a week out from the presidential elections, and absolutely no one cares about them here. In recent polling, when asked about which news stories people most remembered from the previous week, only 1% named the upcoming elections. And sure, there were some big events, but this close to the actual event and no one is even paying attention to the election. Also, the non-Putin candidates have been holding televised debates, but as far as I can tell, the only people in the country who are watching them are political analysts, and really that's only so that they have something to write about the next day. No one cares about the presidential elections here, but I suppose that's maybe not a huge surprise. The Gosduma passed a law over the span of a few days, from start to finish, that largely has made it impossible for foreign agents to earn money in Russia, at least through advertising. Now, the way it works is that companies can't advertise their goods and services through foreign agents without there being serious fines. As many of them, foreign agents, are writers or journalists of some sorts. They relied on ad revenue to continue their work, with YouTube video sponsorships being a common method. However, deputies who passed the law haven't really been able to explain all the details of how the new law will work. As it stands, a number of independent journalists, such as Pivovarov and Gardeyeva, they have announced that they'll be halting their work or greatly reducing the scope of their operations. And while the law is supposedly designed to punish foreign agents, which is in reality just a designation about funding and not supposed to be a punishment, the new law could easily backfire. For journalists working abroad, this law will likely not change their financial situation, and if it does, it will simply mean that they rely more on foreign funds, making them even more of a foreign agent in theory. For other journalists who beforehand had relied almost exclusively on donations from Russian supporters, it's possible that they will be open to funding from foreign sources, which would just be further supposed radicalization in the eyes of the Russian government. It's also possible that large companies will just simply pay the fines, plan the additional expense into their ad expenses. Finally, the new law could be used to attack businesses loyal to the state or just simply competitors. For example, a small business could be quickly set up that then pays foreign agents to advertise a company that someone else wanted to hurt. As usual, quickly passed legislation with a lot of analysis lacking beforehand. I'm sure we're going to see a little bit of a mess with this in the coming months. The special military operation is currently being used as a political ladder. And Putin openly applauded this in his speech, saying that those who actively serve their country ought to be rewarded with doors being opened for them into the state apparatus, effectively creating a new group of elite within the country. We've already seen also numerous politicians who have been embroiled in scandals. We've seen them ship off to the front lines in order to cleanse their reputation. But the question for many now is where these new elites will fit into the political landscape, one that doesn't regularly see fresh blood, and which instead operates by rotating pre-existing politicians between the various positions. Are some going to get kicked out? Is there going to be more competition? Is there going to be infighting? It could potentially shake up the Russian political system, not necessarily in any meaningful way, but they could all be fighting over the same scraps, the same bone. So we'll have to see where this takes us. I know just a few weeks ago, there was a story connected to a massive countrywide internet outage, so any sense of deja vu here will be warranted. But in the last week of February, another one occurred, this time largely affecting messenger services like Telegram. This time around, though, Roskomnadzor, the government agency which regulates media sources, ostensibly to find weak spots in their defenses, they admitted to being the cause of the downage. Like I said, they said that they did this to supposedly find weak spots in their defenses, but it also just came days before the government blocked access to websites which contain information as to how to get around government internet censorship, things like VPNs. And as such, in the eyes of many, the outage wasn't an attempt to protect citizens from bad actors online, but just another test at how the government can monitor, regulate, and restrict how citizens use the internet. There's no one news story I can point to here, but over the last week or so, I have noticed a substantial uptick in the number of pieces focused on ecology and green technologies. Now, as in normally there are none, and recently there have been, I would say, at least 10 or more. Now, again, I realize that Putin mentioned the need for eco-friendly tech in his speech and how Russia should recycle more, or whatever. But the bulk of these stories were prior to him outlining this new plan. I can only assume that this is connected to the upcoming elections, as, believe it or not, ecology is one of the subjects that will actually get Russians out in the streets in a lot of cases, and even conflicting with the government if ecology is being abused. And let's be real, I'm a big fan of green tech, since I've never fully understood the pushback. Like, even if it's somewhat more expensive than fossil fuels in some instances, isn't a clean environment worth that? Not to mention that the decrease in various diseases that are often brought on by pollution and the subsequent load removed from the healthcare system, like that could be more beneficial in the long run. But anyway, stories like connected to ecology always kind of pique my interest. So as to whether anything comes of these plans and promises, that obviously remains to be seen, as well as whether or not discussions will continue once the election is all wrapped up. I'm going to be keeping my eye on this situation, but yeah, the sudden influx of such news articles, it definitely caught my attention, and I felt like I needed to highlight this. So that said, as for reasons why we might be concerned about what we've done to the planet, well, wildfire season may have already begun in the beginning of March here in Russia, with approximately 7,400 hectares ablaze in Primorsky Krai, and another fire started in the land of the Leopard National Park. After last year's wildfires broke records for total area burned, I think this is probably a little alarming. Let's talk entertainment. It's likely that the Summer Olympics in Paris will not be shown on TV here in Russia because Russia isn't participating, and I'm guessing that paying for the rights presents somewhat of a problem, with international payments and bank transfers being just a massive pain in the rear here. Instead, Russian social network Vkontakte is looking to get the rights for broadcasting the Olympics, so not on television but online. Now, this could boost the site's popularity, but I don't really know how many people will watch the Olympics without national athletes. Then again, I'm not a sports guy. The Olympics, for me, has always just been something that's on in the background of bars and restaurants once every 4 years. It's kind of this curio that holds your attention for 15 or 20 minutes at a time, and then you just go on and do something else. But anyway, no Olympics, that shouldn't be a problem because Russia just hosted the first ever Игры будущего, the Games of the Future. Now, it was hyped here way more than it deserved, but in light of Russian athletes basically being banned from the Olympics due to rules and laws on both sides, I think the authorities were trying to position it as a worthy alternative. It's not. The event, positioned as the first Phygital Games, a discussing portmanteau of physical and digital, looked to combine esports with real-world physical activities. For example, teams would play FIFA on PlayStation, and then they would go play a match of real football on a field. Or they might play a first-person shooter like CSGO, and then have to go play a match of laser tag. There were also strategy games like Dota. There was drone racing, rhythm games, battle robots. It was just an absolute hodgepodge of events. And while I somewhat understand the intention behind it all, the result was something that really just seemed more like a game show from cable television in the late 1990s, early 2000s. If you remember that vibe, BattleBots, even something like American Gladiators. Ultimately, in my opinion, the problem with the Games of the Future and why I don't think it or its ilk will ever be interesting to watch is that such just disparate events aren't interesting for the average person. I'm not a gymnast or a figure skater, but I can sit and appreciate what they're able to do, 100%. Now, watching someone nail a perfect run in Dance Dance Revolution or Beat Saber, that just doesn't produce the same sense of awe. Can I watch a ski jumper or a pole vaulter and easily understand how everything they're doing works with ease? Now, with Dota 2 and World of Tanks, all the mechanics and counterplay might be of interest to fellow gamers, but for those who don't play, it doesn't necessarily make any sense. And let's be real, laser tag might be fun to play, but it's not a spectator sport. Speaking of games, on February 27th, Steam, one of the world's largest computer game marketplaces, was placed in the registry here in Russia of websites that hosts information forbidden in the Russian Federation. Now, less than 2 hours later, news came out that Steam had been removed from the list. This might have just been an oversight, or it could have been a sign that the government is looking to put Steam on the list. The reason for possibly adding it to the registry could be any number of games which don't paint Russia and especially Putin in a very positive light. Or it could be the fact that there are countless games on Steam that feature LGBTQ protagonists or storylines. Still, to block Steam would be a surefire way to alienate the youth even further and to push people to do more pirating, which basically negates the theory of blocking things in the first place if you're just going to download whatever you want anyway. A bit earlier, on the 21st of February, a list of books that were banned for containing LGBTQ propaganda, which could mean anything from a character being openly gay to mere hints of homosexuality, this list was leaked on Telegram. It was for online retailers, and they were not supposed to sell these books, even though they hadn't been officially banned by the state. The retailers tried to say it wasn't true, that it was just a past list that had been for the purpose of discussion, but when people searched for the books that were on the list on these retailers, they found no results. Weird. While the quiet dissemination of a list of books that are to be shadow banned is not at all surprising given the current atmosphere of censorship in Russia, what caught people's attention were names like Stephen King, Oscar Wilde, even Dostoevsky. Later, the government released a statement that they would not be banning any classics, which is a nebulous term. Doesn't mean anything. So it seems that the book list was maybe just a way for the government to look less iron-fisted if or when they do release a trimmed-down ban list in the future, one without whatever they deem to be classics. February 23rd was the Defenders of the Fatherland Day, and I have to say, among Russians, it's a rather tepid affair. It's kind of similar to Memorial or Labor Day in the States. It's an extra day off, but there's no agreed-upon way to celebrate it because it is a state-created holiday, which is fine. Everyone likes a day off. But sweet baby Jesus on a carousel, the fireworks display that they unleashed that evening was just atrociously ostentatious. And I'm not the only one to have noticed this either, as multiple Telegram channels posted their surprise at the extravagance, especially considering that no such displays were made on New Year's Eve. As it turns out, Moscow wasn't the only city that had them. Volgograd, Kerch, Murmansk, St. Petersburg, Novorossiysk, Sevastopol, Smolensk, and Tula, along with any other cities in which there are various military headquarters, they were all supposed to have fireworks displays on the 23rd at the behest of Sergei Shoigu, Russia's Minister of Defense. It's always nice to see the government just spending full speed ahead when it concerns military holidays and not the ones people regard as their most beloved. Turning to politics concerning Russia in the former Soviet Union. Things aren't looking good for the Organizatsiya Договора о коллективной безопасности, or the Collective Security Treaty Organization, ODKB for short in Russian. For those unfamiliar with ODKB, it's something like NATO for Russia and former Soviet states. And I know that's a simplification that I was going to rub some people the wrong way, but if you compare the NATO Charter and the ODKB's founding document, there are plenty of similarities. The reason for ODKB's current woes lie with Armenia and Azerbaijan and the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, the reason which Azeris took control of last year. Armenia was not happy about this, and the government there is worried about potential future conflict. As part of Azerbaijan, Nakhchivan is separated from the rest of Azerbaijan by the Sunak region of Armenia. The region just down there is a mess of Iranian and Turkish interests, Armenia in the former camp and Azerbaijan in the latter, and the Soviets' division of territories laid the foundations for problems the problems that we see today, just kind of like European colonial powers did for Africa and the Middle East. But back to the ODKB. Armenia was displeased, to say the least, that Russia and the other members of the organization didn't come to Armenia's aid when Azerbaijan used its military to take control of Nagorno-Karabakh. At the time of the conflict, it was seen as a failure of the ODKB, and Armenia, who in theory should have been able to rely on support from other members as it was being attacked by another member, especially Russia, but nobody came. And as a result, Armenia has been questioning their involvement in the organization to the point where it's kind of de facto finished. At the same time, the president of Armenia, Pashinyan, he has been in talks with France for military support and also with the European Union to strengthen economic ties. There's not much more to report on this situation at the moment, but this just seems to be getting started or continuing, so expect more news from the Russian-Armenian relationship in the future. We also need to talk about Transnistria, the far eastern autonomous part of Moldova. On the 28th of February, they made an announcement that they had been building up to all week. The secrecy and the timing of it, a day before Putin's speech, led many to fear that the region would ask Moscow for protection, possibly opening up another military front. But as it stands, the region's politicians simply asked Russia, the UN, and the EU Parliament, among others, for help in dealing with an economic blockade from the Moldovan side. And they just didn't want the conflict to escalate further. But just as with Armenia, this is a new locale that I feel like we're going to be keeping our eye on. The biggest economic story of this last period of time has been that two banks were shuttered by the government. The larger and more important one being Kiwi Bank. Kiwi is well known here in Russia, not for being a bank necessarily, but for operating these electronic wallets, functioning just as another payment system. So people could load cash into special Kiwi terminals and then have that cash get transferred to their electronic wallet, and then they could use that to make payments or transfer to other wallets. It was honestly incredibly popular in the past. Even in cities, it's still being used to this day in the Russian Far East, for example, for citizens to make utilities payments, and it has been, obviously prior to it shutting down, extremely popular with migrant workers because it was very easy for them to transfer money back to their home countries through the Kiwi terminals. So obviously when Kiwi Bank was shut down, people who used these services, they immediately encountered difficulties with some communities in, like I mentioned, the Russian Far East. They were just unable to make any sort of government payments. And again, migrant workers were unable to transfer funds. But also Russians who relocated maybe to Kazakhstan or wherever in the last year or so, they've been unable to receive payments. The bank closed down for monetary problems, though there was also talk about these electronic wallets being used for funding illegal activities, which, is maybe not a huge surprise. A few pieces of smaller economic news. First, rumors regarding the central bank possibly raising key interest rates to 17%. They have not disappeared, and analysts are currently split over the possibility of a decrease by the end of March, or again, that increase to 17%. Though all of the initiatives that Putin outlined have caused most to reevaluate any rosy predictions. Next, according to a poll conducted by the Telegram channel Brief, with the question, quote, "Are there goods, the growing price of which causes you to feel worried?" In response to that question, 40% of respondents felt worry at rising food prices and or the decrease in selection on store shelves. 18% felt the same with regard to cars and parts, 11% to consumer appliances and electronics, 9% to real estate and utilities, another 9% to medical goods, and 8% to clothing and shoes. That said, 38% of respondents didn't feel any worries about their material well-being, which is an answer that was more common among pensioners, believe it or not. But that could be interpreted as many of them already being in such a tenuous position that an increase of prices just doesn't really see their lives getting any worse than it currently is. Next up, the Russian government, we learned, is planning to change their approach to import tariffs in a move that, let's be real, will likely hurt consumers already feeling that pinch. So currently, 1,000 euros worth of goods can be brought across the border tax-free, but that number might be dropped to 200 euros or a minimum of €1 per kilogram. This just means that importers will be paying more to bring goods across the border, goods which in most instances have already been imported from the West into friendly countries like Kazakhstan, which is just one of the reasons why prices on things like consumer electronics is already so high, sometimes like twice what the price is abroad. Additionally, there is talk of dropping tax-free imports altogether in the future, and this all has some businesses fretting seriously. Lastly, the government has ended the export of gasoline for the next 6 months. And now there are two likely reasons for this. The first being that petroleum processing plants in Nizhny Novgorod and Volgograd, they need to lessen their production rates so that they can undertake repairs. Secondly, though, and more importantly, the second half of 2023 saw fuel prices increase at what for many was an alarming rate. And although they stabilized and decreased a tidge at the end of the year, they actually began another ascent at the end of February, which went uninterrupted for 2 weeks. All of this has made prices substantially higher now than they were a year ago. And by banning exports, the Russian government is probably hoping that it will be able to avoid any further increases in gasoline prices. Still, some people theorize that the plan was also to help out beleaguered farmers during the sowing season. But the new ban doesn't touch diesel. So unless Russian tractors are just wildly different from all the tractors I've ever known, gasoline prices won't make hardly any difference to farmers. As to why they didn't put a ban on diesel exports, well, the main export for Russian petroleum companies is not gasoline, but diesel. So according to Rossiyskaya Gazeta, a total ban on diesel exports would be painful to such companies, and it might influence the total volume of oil they extract, as well as the amount processed, which in turn would hurt the Russian budget. And we are finished. There was just so much there, and that's kind of what I want to talk about here at the end. It's what I hinted to at the very beginning. I'm not going to be doing the Russian week in review anymore, just because it's simply too much of a chore to try and curate all this information over the course of 7 days or more. Smaller stories that are worth getting attention become eclipsed by larger ones that spawn out of nowhere. And then these big stories end up competing with one another, and I wind up with pages upon pages of notes and still not enough time to go into everything. Seriously, a lot of the stories in this video, looking back on them, I feel like I just skated right over the surface of them because there was too much to cover. Like, hell, I didn't even talk about the V-Square report, which leaked a few days before Putin's speech, and which gave insight into how Kremlin finances TV, film, and other forms of entertainment. Nor did I bring up how more factories in Russia are being nationalized, both those previously owned by foreign holdings and those owned by Russians. These nationalizations becoming more and more common in the last months. So yeah, even after listening to me yap for all of this time, there's still a lot that I didn't have the time or the energy to cover. So what will happen to the Russian week in review? Well, I'm going to try and split it up. So instead of it being once every week or so, I'll try to do videos a few times a week so I can focus on smaller stories or a discussion among analysts. It should also help because the news will be still kind of fresh in my mind. And that, coupled with the coming spring weather, will hopefully make it easier for me to do such videos outside of the confines which we currently find ourselves in. So expect to see more of me more often in the future as I settle into a new release schedule. If you've made it this far, I applaud your curiosity and or fortitude. Likes, comments, shares, always greatly appreciated. For now, though, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.